The cold, bitter winds of January 1536 swept through the halls of Kimbolton Castle, a grim foretelling of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Inside, Queen Katherine of Aragon lay on her bed, her once vibrant eyes now dulled by illness and despair. Her heart, once strong and resolute, now beat with the faintest of pulses. Outside, the world was unaware of the impending storm, but inside, the air was heavy with the weight of an ending. Catherine's steward and physician had sent urgent messages to Eustace Chapuys, the imperial ambassador, begging him to visit. The queen was deteriorating rapidly, and they feared the worst. Chapuys, a man of deep loyalty and compassion, felt a sense of duty to the woman who had been his friend and the symbol of resistance against King Henry VIII's tyranny. He knew that time was running out. Chapuys arrived at Kimbolton on a cold January morning, accompanied by Stephen Vaughan, a trusted friend and diplomat. The castle was eerily silent, the only sound the creaking of the ancient wooden floors under their feet. As they approached Catherine's chamber, Chapuys felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He knew what he would find, but he hoped against hope that she might still pull through. When he entered the room, the sight that greeted him was heart-wrenching. Katherine lay pale and frail, her once regal presence reduced to a mere shadow. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Chapuys with a flicker of recognition. They spoke in Spanish, their native tongue, as if to bridge the gap between the living and the dying. "Thank you, Chapuys," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For all your efforts, for your loyalty. I know I have been a burden to you." Chapuys knelt beside her, his heart heavy. "You have never been a burden, your majesty. You have been a beacon of strength and justice. The world will remember you as such." Over the next few days, Chapuys tried to lift her spirits, but it was clear that Katherine had given up the fight. She spoke of her fears, of the deaths of Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, and of the religious turmoil that had engulfed her people. Chapuys reassured her, but the doubts lingered in her eyes. On the morning of January 5th, Chapuys bid her farewell, believing she was on the mend. But as he left Kimbolton, a sense of foreboding settled over him. 2 days later, while he was en route to London, the news reached him. Katherine was gone. She had passed away quietly, far from her daughter, her husband, and the people she had dedicated her life to serving. Chapuys arrived in London on January 9th, expecting a sombre court. Instead, he found a scene of jubilation. King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, his new queen, were almost indecently overjoyed. Henry, who had long desired Catherine's removal, saw her death as the end of a long and tiresome chapter. He roared with delighted laughter, declaring that they were now free from the threat of war and could deal with the French on better terms. The court was a sea of yellow, the color of rebirth and new beginnings, as Henry and Anne celebrated their newfound freedom. Henry paraded his daughter, Elizabeth, through the halls, a clear symbol of the new dynasty. For Chapuys, the scene was unbearable. His grief, guilt, and anger boiled over, and he felt a deep sense of betrayal. In his first dispatch to Emperor Charles V, Chapuys poured out his heart. If it should please God to take her to himself, it would at least be a consolation to die as it were in my arms, and not all alone like a beast. His letter to Pedro Ortiz was even more emotional, revealing the depth of his sorrow and the sense of loss he felt. Chapuys' grief quickly turned to suspicion. He was convinced that Henry had played a role in Catherine's death, perhaps even poisoning her. The hasty burial and the suspicious autopsy results only fueled his paranoia. He began to investigate, systematically eliminating suspects. Henry and Thomas Cromwell were ruled out, leaving Anne as the primary suspect. Her malice towards Katherine and her growing fear of losing Henry's favor made her a likely culprit in Chapuys' mind. The court's celebration of Catherine's death was a turning point for Chapuys. His loyalty to Katherine and his deep sense of justice were now more important than ever. He saw Anne as a concubine, a usurper, and a threat to the true heir, Princess Mary. His reports to Charles became more urgent, and he began to view Mary as a key player in the ongoing political drama. Meanwhile, Princess Mary received news of her mother's death from an indifferent source in Elizabeth's household. She had no time to grieve, but Chapuys saw her as a valuable pawn in the larger game. Mary, the only undisputed heir, could still be a powerful ally for the Holy Roman Empire and France. Catherine's quiet burial at Peterborough Cathedral far from the grandeur of Westminster, was a final insult to her memory. Chapuys described the funeral with a mix of sorrow and outrage. "Such have been the wonderful display and incredible magnificence which these people gave me to understand, would be lavished in honor and memory of one whose great virtues and royal relationship certainly entitled her to uncommon honors." The day of Anne's miscarriage, January 25th, was marked by another tragedy. Henry, who had narrowly escaped death during a jousting accident, was furious and disappointed. Anne, already on edge, lashed out at her uncle, blaming him for her loss. The court was abuzz with rumors, and Chapuys' report captured the tension and uncertainty of the moment. Henry's growing affection for Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting, added to the instability. Anne, now more vulnerable than ever, felt the weight of her failures. Henry's coldness towards her was evident, and Chapuys reported that the king had left her at Greenwich, vowing to speak to her only when she recovered. In early February, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer delivered a scathing sermon at St. Paul's Cathedral, declaring Pope Paul to be the Antichrist and Henry to be the true head of the Church. Chapuys, who detested Cranmer, noted the Archbishop's venomous tone and the echoes of similar sermons from other prelates in the weeks to come. The thunder rolls, and the storm is far from over. The court of King Henry VIII is a place of shifting alliances, deep suspicions, and hidden agendas. For Chapuys, the death of Katherine of Aragon is a call to action, a reminder that the fight for justice and truth is far from won. The ambassador, Chapuys, was deeply worried. Katherine, the former queen, had passed away, and Henry, the king, showed no signs of making peace with the Pope. As time went by, it seemed Henry was becoming more stubborn. Chapuys knew he had to act. He believed it was his duty to try and bring Henry back to the Church, to show him the dangers of his actions and the chaos it could bring to his kingdom. Charles, the powerful emperor, understood the gravity of the situation. He asked Chapuys to mediate between Henry and the Pope, hoping to find a quiet solution. Charles gave Chapuys a long list of terms, but some were contradictory, making it hard to navigate. Charles stressed that Chapuys should present these ideas as his own to avoid upsetting Henry. The goal was to improve relations between England and the Empire, but without compromising Mary's rights. Mary's position was precarious. Henry had shown some kindness to her, but he was determined to have a male heir. Anne Boleyn, Henry's current wife, was falling out of favor, and the king was showing interest in a new marriage. Chapuys saw an opportunity to help Mary by supporting a new wife for Henry, as long as Mary was treated well. One day, Chapuys visited Thomas Cromwell, a powerful man at court. Cromwell tried to be friendly, hoping to gain Chapuys' support for an alliance between England and the Empire. Cromwell mentioned that if Henry remarried, his new wife wouldn't be French, which would please Charles. Cromwell's overly friendly tone made Chapuys suspicious, but he played along, knowing it could be useful. In April, Chapuys hosted a dinner at his house. The guests included influential people like Henry Grey and Henry Pole. They discussed Henry's possible new marriage and the growing rift between Cromwell and Anne. Chapuys shared a rumor that Henry had asked for the hand of Francis's daughter, but he was skeptical. The next day, he visited Cromwell to confirm the rumor. Cromwell's manner was cold and indifferent as he spoke about Henry's future plans, but then he smiled, which made Chapuys wonder if Cromwell was trying to gain his trust. The English Reformation was in full swing, with Henry closing monasteries and taking their wealth. Cromwell was leading this effort, which didn't sit well with Anne. She and Cromwell had a falling out, and Chapuys' spies kept him informed of the religious changes. The church was being stripped of its traditions, and many people were unhappy. Around this time, a new woman, Jane Seymour, caught Henry's eye. She was different from Anne, quiet and reserved. When Henry tried to woo her with a gift, Jane returned it, saying she valued her honor above all. This impressed Henry, and he began to court her more seriously. Jane's supporters, including Nicholas Caro, coached her on how to win Henry's favor and turn him against Anne. Chapuys heard that Caro was working hard to bring down Anne, and Jane was willing to help. Jane became popular with the conservative faction at court, who had never fully supported Anne. Jane spoke honestly to Henry about Anne's unpopularity, and Henry listened. Chapuys was approached by Jane's supporters to help bring down Anne, but he was cautious. His main concern was Mary, and anyone who supported her had his support. Cromwell and Chapuys worked together to forge an alliance between England and the Empire. Charles agreed to mediate between Henry and the Pope, and in return, Henry would help in the war against the Turks and the French, and restore Mary to the succession. Cromwell was optimistic about the alliance, and Henry was pleased when he heard the news. On Easter Monday, Cromwell asked Chapuys to visit Anne, thinking it would please Henry, but Chapuys refused, saying it wasn't a good idea. Henry's counselors, including Thomas and George Boleyn, greeted Chapuys warmly. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, tried to make a good impression, but Chapuys was wary. He knew the Boleyns were nervous about their falling influence. At Mass, Chapuys and Anne finally met. Anne was affable, even turning to return Chapuys's bow. Some saw this as a sign that Anne was trying to make peace with Charles through Chapuys, but Chapuys didn't read too much into it. He knew Anne was vulnerable, and that her position was precarious. After Mass, Chapuys dined with Edward Seymour, Jane's brother. They were hopeful about the upcoming meeting with Henry. However, when Chapuys presented the proposals, Henry's reaction was unexpected. He burst out laughing, and then angrily berated Cromwell. The meeting ended poorly, and Chapuys realized that Henry was unpredictable and could easily change his mind. Despite the setback, Chapuys remained determined to help Mary and find a way to restore peace between England and the Empire. The air at the court of King Henry VIII was thick with tension as a heated argument erupted between Henry and his minister, Thomas Cromwell. The king's fiery words sent Cromwell storming out of the room, visibly agitated, and he took a seat to have a drink. Henry, however, was not done. His next target was Eustace Chapuys, the Spanish ambassador. Henry's face was red with anger as he vented his frustrations. He told Chapuys that the Pope's issues were none of Charles V's business, and that he, Henry, could do as he pleased with his own daughter, Mary. When Chapuys suggested that England should join forces against the Turks, Henry dismissed the idea, saying it was important to first re-establish old friendships and not burden people with unnecessary expenses. Henry's temper kept flaring, and he lashed out at Charles V, claiming that without his help, Charles would never have gained the Empire or Spain. He accused Charles of betrayal, recalling how Charles had abandoned him after a victory at Pavia. Henry's words were a mix of real and imagined grievances, and he seemed to be unburdening himself of years of pent-up frustration. Cromwell and Thomas Audley, the Lord Chancellor, watched in silence, clearly uncomfortable with the king's outburst. Henry grudgingly agreed to address the proposals the next morning, hoping to have a clearer head. Chapuys, despite the king's harsh words, remained calm and patient, trying to defuse the situation. When he left, he was followed by Cromwell, who was deeply troubled. They both felt shocked and mortified by Henry's reaction to their carefully crafted treaty. Cromwell, who was hardly able to speak, was more humiliated than ever in his life. Chapuys advised him to drop the issue and focus on finding a husband for Princess Mary. The next day, Henry's mood did not improve. During a meeting with the French ambassador, he unleashed his anger once more, writing a threatening letter to King Francis I to stop pursuing a marriage for Mary. The French ambassador left just as mortified as Chapuys had been the day before. Chapuys quickly informed Charles V of Henry's reaction, which shocked the emperor. In his response, Charles expressed his disappointment and surprise at Henry's coldness. He emphasized that the mission Chapuys had undertaken was honest and reasonable, and deserved a more gracious reply from Henry. Charles also mentioned that he was willing to forget the past and focus on the future, showing a willingness to mend their relationship. Regarding Princess Mary, Charles was remarkably understanding. He believed that Henry, as a good father, would make the right decisions for her well-being. He also noted that if Henry had ever rejected Mary, it was likely due to the influence of others, not Henry himself. Charles's response was a clear signal that he was ready to move forward, despite Henry's outburst. On St. George's Day, April 23, 1536, the atmosphere at court was particularly tense. A space had opened up in the Order of the Garter, the highest chivalric order in Britain. Instead of Anne Boleyn's brother, George, being chosen, the honor was given to Nicholas Kerr, a supporter of Jane Seymour. This was a clear snub to the Boleyn family, and a sign that Anne's power was waning. Care, emboldened by his promotion, began tutoring Jane and sending messages to Mary, assuring her that Anne's downfall was near. Mary, however, remained calm, and had forgiven the past wrongs done to her and her mother. The following days saw a series of dramatic events. On April 30th, Mark Smeaton, a musician in Anne's household, was brought to Cromwell's house for questioning. Under pressure, he admitted to having had a sexual relationship with the Queen. This confession was the beginning of a rapid and devastating fall for Anne. On May 1st, during the May Day jousts, Henry received news of Smeaton's confession. He abruptly left the event, never to see Anne again. Henry Norris, one of Anne's closest friends, was also accused of having an affair with her, and was imprisoned in the Tower of London the next morning. Anne was arrested at Greenwich while watching a tennis match and was taken to the Tower. Over the next few days, other men accused of adultery with Anne, including her brother George, were also arrested and imprisoned. Anne's behavior in the Tower did not help her cause. She made unguarded statements that sealed the fates of those accused with her. Chapuys, the Spanish ambassador, was one of the few people who provided a detailed account of Anne's last days. He wrote that Anne had blamed Chapuys personally for her fall from grace, which he found amusing. Despite the dire circumstances, Chapuys noted that Henry showed no signs of mourning. Instead, he was openly courting Jane Seymour, even promising to marry her before Anne's arrest. Henry and Jane's relationship was already causing tension, with Jane advocating for Mary to be restored to the succession, a request that Henry angrily rejected. The public mood was one of shock and disbelief. Henry's joy at Anne's downfall was evident, and he was seen dining with different ladies and enjoying late-night parties on the Thames. Chapuys could hardly believe the king's behavior, and compared it to the joy of getting rid of an old horse in favor of a new one. As the trial approached, rumors swirled around the court. Chapuys was skeptical of the charges against Anne, noting that the other men were sentenced on very slight grounds. Anne and her brother George were tried separately on May 15, 1536. Despite giving plausible denials, Anne was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. She received the news calmly, expressing sorrow that innocent men would die because of her. Her sentence was later changed to beheading by the sword. Chapuys's account of these events paints a picture of a court in turmoil, where loyalty and trust were in short supply, and the king's actions were driven by his own desires and political ambitions. The fall of Anne Boleyn was a dramatic and tragic event, but it was also a turning point in the history of the English court. Chapuys, the Spanish ambassador, never believed the charges against Anne Boleyn and her brother George. He thought the accusations were ridiculous and unfair. Despite not liking Anne or George much, he was convinced that they were innocent. Chapuys was particularly impressed by how well George defended himself during the trial. He spoke so convincingly that many people in the courtroom were sure he would be set free. However, no witnesses were called to give evidence against him, which was unusual. When George was accused of saying that King Henry was impotent, he responded cleverly, saying he couldn't speculate about such matters. This made the courtroom burst into laughter, but it didn't help his case. Despite his eloquent defense, George was found guilty, much to everyone's surprise. George remained calm and dignified, even after being sentenced to death. He admitted that he deserved to die, not for the charges against him, but for spreading new religious ideas that were considered heretical. He asked for forgiveness and promised to pay his debts. Chapuys noted with a mix of distaste and sympathy that George and the other men accused with Anne were executed on Tower Hill, where Anne could see them from her window. Chapuys believed this was a cruel gesture from Henry. On May 19, 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold. She gave a short speech, and then she was beheaded with a single stroke of the sword. Chapuys, who was not allowed to witness the execution, reported that Anne had shown great courage and readiness to meet her end. He felt a deep sense of disgust at how she had been treated and admired her bravery. After Anne's death, Henry quickly moved on. He was already betrothed to Jane Seymour, a woman very different from Anne. Jane was quiet, gentle, and obedient qualities that Henry seemed to prefer in a wife after the stormy relationship with Anne. Chapuys was surprised by Henry's choice, but noted that Jane had been a lady in waiting to both Katherine and Anne. just like Anne herself had been to Katherine. This pattern of Henry falling for his mistress's attendance was peculiar, but not unprecedented. Chapuys found Jane to be of average beauty, fair-skinned, and a bit older than she appeared. He noted that she was not particularly witty, but had good understanding. He also heard that she could be proud and haughty. For Chapuys, what mattered most was what Jane could bring to the alliance between England and the Holy Roman Empire. He was hopeful that Jane would be a better choice for Henry, and that her reign would be more stable. Jane's rise to queen was not as sudden as it might seem. She had been Henry's infatuation for several months, and her supporters, including her family and key courtiers, had been working to secure her position. Chapuys, initially skeptical of Jane's morals, came to see her as a capable and intelligent woman. He believed that her marriage to Henry could be successful, and he hoped it would bring peace and stability to the kingdom. However, Chapuys' letters from this period are sparse, and we lose much of his perspective on Jane's reign. Despite this, it is clear that Jane was more than just a quiet and obedient wife. She was ambitious and had the support of a strong faction at court. Chapuys, who had been a constant presence during Anne's reign, now turned his attention to the new queen, hoping that she would bring the change and stability that England needed. As the dust settled after Anne Boleyn's dramatic fall and execution, a new era began at the English court. Henry VIII quickly married Jane Seymour, a woman who promised stability and a gentle touch. Chapuys, the ever-watchful ambassador, found himself navigating the shifting tides of Henry's court with a mix of optimism and caution. Jane Seymour, the new queen, was a breath of fresh air. Unlike Anne, who had been bold and often confrontational, Jane was calm and gracious. She won the hearts of many, including Chapuys, who saw in her a resemblance to Henry's first wife, Katherine. Jane's influence was already being felt, and there were whispers that she might help restore Mary, Henry's daughter from his first marriage, to the royal succession. Chapuys, who had suffered from gout and fever, was recovering and eager to see what the future held. He believed that with Jane's help, Mary might finally be reconciled with her father. When Chapuys met Jane, he was impressed by her kindness and intelligence. She promised to do all she could for Mary, and Chapuys was hopeful. However, Henry's demands were harsh. He insisted that Mary acknowledge her parents' marriage as invalid and recognize him as the supreme head of the church. Despite the threats and pressure from Henry's counselors, Mary initially refused. It was Chapuys who convinced her to capitulate, knowing that her father's anger could be dangerous. Mary finally signed the document, and the change in her treatment was immediate. Henry welcomed her back with open arms, and Jane gave her a diamond ring as a token of her affection. Chapuys was relieved and overjoyed. He had worked tirelessly to protect Mary, and now it seemed his efforts were paying off. Yet he remained cautious. Henry's temper was unpredictable, and the political landscape was always shifting. Chapuys continued to monitor the situation, hoping that Mary's restoration would be permanent. Meanwhile, Chapuys's personal life was also in flux. He was deeply involved in the affairs of his family, back in Annecy and Geneva. He sent money to his mother, Gigon, and supported his nephew, Philippe, who had joined his household in London. Philippe was a promising young man, much like his uncle, and Chapuys took great pride in his success. However, he had some concerns about his niece, Alexandrine, whose choice of marriage had disappointed him. As 1537 drew to a close, Chapuys reflected on the year's events. Jane Seymour was pregnant, and there was hope for a male heir. Mary was back in her father's favor, and the English people seemed content. Chapuys, the ever-dedicated ambassador, continued to serve his emperor, Charles V, and his own family, always looking forward to the next challenge. The court was a place of constant change, but Chapuys remained a steady presence, his loyalty and determination unwavering. He had seen Henry at his best and his worst, and he knew that the future was uncertain. Yet with Jane as queen and Mary restored, there was a glimmer of hope that the turbulent waters of the Tudor court might finally find some peace.